Alright, welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to cover the top 10 deadliest mass shootings in Canadian history. Now, Canada isn't exactly known for its mass shootings like the United States. And in general, Canada has had far fewer gun deaths than the US on a per capita basis. Canada has also traditionally had a reputation for being soft, gentle, and peaceful, although this seems to be rapidly changing. Canada has the same problems as any other country, and we have had some significant mass shooting events. There are actually several slightly different definitions of what qualifies as a mass shooting. But in general, this is a violent event in which one or more attackers uses a firearm to kill or injure multiple people. Typically, this is defined as an event in which 4 or more people are killed or injured, excluding the perpetrator. Mass shootings are also characterized by the targeting of victims in a non-combat setting, and the term generally excludes gang violence and warfare. Canada has had many mass shootings during wartime and involving organized crime, and I have not included those incidents on this list. However, I have covered some of these events in my Canadian gang videos. And so I've compiled the top 10 deadliest mass shooting events in Canadian history, ranked from number 10 to number 1 in terms of the number of people killed. As a quick note, numbers 10 through 8 on this list each had 6 fatalities, not including the perpetrator, and I had to select from a number of incidents with 6 fatalities. There were more than 3. At number 10 is the 1972 Kettle Valley shooting, which was one of the worst mass shootings in BC's history. 27-year-old William Bernard Lepine was born in the US and moved to Canada. He would spend some time in the East Kootenay Mental Health Unit in Cranbrook, and in May of 1972 he was admitted to the Riverview Mental Hospital in Coquitlam, but quickly escaped. He was then captured and sent back to the hospital on July 6 of 1972, but escaped again on July 30th. At around 9 a.m. on August 28th of 1972, William Lepine walked onto an orchard in Oliver, BC armed with 2 rifles and shot 2 workers to death while they were working on irrigation equipment. He put their bodies into their Land Rover and drove northeast to a campground on the Damfino Creek near Kelowna. He then discarded the dead bodies outside the campground on Kettle Valley Road and then entered the campground and opened fire on 2 couples. Phyllis Clark was killed in this attack and the other 3 were injured. Lepine then fled the campground, and then shortly after this 2 of the wounded people drove to Westbridge, where they alerted the local RCMP, and pretty soon about 25 officers started searching for Lepine. Later that same afternoon, Lepine killed Herbert and Nellie Thomas near Edgewood and escaped in their car. 30 miles north of Edgewood, Lepine shot Thomas Posney to death while he was fishing at Lower Arrow Lake. Lepine was finally arrested the next morning by RCMP around Galena Bay, and in total he had killed 6 people and left 3 others injured. Lepine was found to suffer from schizophrenia, and he believed that he was chosen to save the world from a nuclear holocaust. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he has been locked up in various psychiatric hospitals ever since. At number 9 is the Quebec City Mosque shooting. You might remember this happening. On January 29th of 2017, 27-year-old Alexander Bissonnette walked into the Quebec Islamic Cultural Center around 8 p.m. and opened fire on a group of about 40 people who were socializing and performing evening prayers. 6 people were killed and 5 others were injured. Bissonnette fled the scene, but he soon called police to surrender. Alexander Bissonnette came from a good, stable home, and he had no criminal record prior to the shootings. People said that he held far-right, white nationalist, and anti-Muslim views, and that he generally supported right-wing politicians, but he was also known to have praised the centre-left Parti Québécois and their nationalist policies. Bissonnette later told police that he was inspired by the 2014 shootings at Parliament Hill, in which a Canadian soldier guarding the National War Memorial was killed. Many people, including then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, called this a terrorist attack, but Bissonnette was never ultimately charged with terrorism. Alexander Bissonnette eventually pled guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder and 5 counts of attempted murder, and on February 8th of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 40 years. He later appealed his sentence, and this was adjusted to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and he is eligible for parole in 2042. There are many YouTube videos on this event, and you can also find a video of Bissonnette's interrogation by Quebec police. At number 8 is the 2001 Kirkland Shootings, also in Quebec. This series of shootings took place in the Kirkland and Notre Dame de Grace communities of Montreal from September 18th to September 20th in 2001. The perpetrator was 51-year-old John Bauer, who was a former athlete who owed over $200,000, which included gambling debts. His debts included money owed to his father-in-law and to his business partner. A few months before the murders, he had lost his job and he was in a very bad place financially. On September 18th of 2001, John Bauer shot his wife and 3 sons to death in their home with a stolen .22 caliber revolver. The next day, on September 19th, he shot and killed his father-in-law at his house in the Notre Dame de Grace neighborhood. And then finally the next morning on September 20th, he shot and killed his business partner. He then returned home, set fire to his house, and committed suicide. After the shootings, one of Bauer's bosses revealed that he was also invited to Bauer's home on September 20th, and he would have likely been another victim if he showed up. Authorities speculated that this rampage was motivated by financial troubles, and this was one of the worst mass shootings that has occurred in Quebec. At number 7 is an event that happened near the small town of Erskin, Alberta in 1956. This one was fairly unique in that the murders were carried out by a politician. John Edgar Clark was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, winning his seat in 1952, and then again in 1955 in Alberta's general elections as part of Alberta's Social Credit political party. While serving as a politician in Alberta, John Clark was hospitalized for a month and a half after a nervous breakdown in 1954, and another time during the Alberta Legislature's spring session of 1956. John Clark lived with his wife and 4 kids on a farm near Erskin, Alberta. On June 3rd of 1956, a neighbor named Pete Parrott made a social visit to the Clark farm and found a scene of absolute carnage. He found 6 dead bodies as well as a person that was wounded, and everyone had been shot at least once in the head with a .22 caliber bullet. The wounded victim was taken to the hospital where they soon died. The dead people were John's wife Margaret, his son Ross, his daughters Janina, Anne, and Linda, a hired farmhand, as well as an unnamed visitor. John was initially not found near the house, and it was thought that he had fled the scene. Soon, a team of 32 Mounties on horseback along with a team of tracking dogs were scouring the property. They also had a team of 3 Mounties on a Royal Canadian Air Force Otter conducting an aerial search, and it was the police in the aircraft that spotted Clark's body a few hours after the search began. John Clark was deceased. He was wearing his nightclothes and he had a single self-inflicted bullet wound to his head. And although John Clark had had mental issues prior to the shootings, police were left without a clear motive, and this was one of the deadliest mass murders in Alberta's history. At number 6 is the 1965 Coquitlam Massacre, and there was another very interesting perpetrator in this case. Leonard Raymond Hogue was from the Winnipeg area and moved with his wife and 2 children to Vancouver in the early 1950s. Leonard Hogue graduated from the Vancouver Police Department in 1956, and it was noted that he was the pistol shooting champion of his class. He initially worked as a patrolman in Vancouver and later transferred to the city prison. In the early 1960s, Hogue started committing brazen crimes with other policemen. There was a series of thefts where robbers made off with bags of cash from Dairy Queen freezers around the Vancouver area. And around the same time in the same area, there was a series of robberies at homes of wealthy people who were on vacation and reported their absence to local police. It was thought that these were committed by Hogue and his gang of rogue policemen. In November of 1961, a local gun shop was looted, 14 guns were stolen by the group, and these were used in further robberies. In 1962, Hogue and 2 other officers robbed a bank, and soon after, Leonard Hogue bought a nice house in the affluent Coquitlam area. On February 11th of 1965, Hogue and 3 officers robbed a Canadian Pacific Railway freight office and made off with $1.2 million in banknotes being sent off for destruction. The bills were drilled with 3-inch holes, rendering them unusable. One of the robbers restored some of the bills, and on April 17th of 1965, 2 of the robbers were arrested after a bartender called police after they consistently paid with patch bills. The next morning, Leonard Hogue learned that 3 members of his gang had been arrested. Around 6 p.m. that same evening, another police officer lent Hogue a .357 Magnum revolver. At approximately 1:30 p.m. on April 20th of 1965, Leonard Hogue shot and killed his wife and 6 children in their home, and then killed himself. Leonard Hogue's body was found on the master bedroom floor. His wife was found in bed, 2 of his children were found in their beds, and the other 4 were found in different areas of the house, and it was believed that they attempted to flee. Everyone had been killed by a single bullet to the head. The bodies were found on the same day that they had been killed, after officials noticed that Hogue had not arrived at work and sent officers to his house. Although it's not entirely clear why Hogue decided to kill his entire family, police speculated that Hogue knew he was about to be arrested for his robberies and completely freaked out. At number 5 is the 2014 Edmonton shootings. 53-year-old Phu Lam was born and raised in Vietnam and had lived in Canada since 1979. He had an extensive criminal record going back to 1987, including drug and violence-related offenses. He met his wife, who was 18 years his junior, on a trip to his home country to Vietnam in 2000. They soon got married and she came to Canada in 2003. Lam had been arrested twice in Edmonton for sexual and domestic assault, and his wife eventually divorced him. In November of 2012, a complaint was filed against Lam after he threatened to kill his ex-wife and 5 relatives. At the time of the shooting, Phu Lam was in bankruptcy proceedings and owed a large amount of money on at least 12 credit cards due to a gambling addiction. On December 29th of 2014, Lam went to a house in the Clairvatin neighborhood of Edmonton and killed 7 people. The victims were his ex-wife and her 8-year-old son, both of her parents. her sister, as well as her sister's 3-year-old daughter, and one of his ex-wife's friends that was also at the house. He then traveled to the southwest neighborhood of Haddo in Edmonton and shot 36-year-old Cindy Dong to death. After his massacre, he drove to Fort Saskatchewan to a Chinese and Vietnamese restaurant where he had after-hours access and committed suicide. Lam had used a 9mm handgun that was reportedly stolen from Surrey, BC in 2006. Police suspect that the murders were due to strained family relationships, financial difficulties, as well as mental illness, and this remains the deadliest mass shooting in Alberta's history. At number 4 is the Shell Lake murders, one of the most well-known massacres in Canadian history. On August 15th of 1967, 21-year-old Victor Ernest Hoffman entered the Peterson family farm in Shell Lake, Saskatchewan, armed with a .22 caliber Browning pump-action repeater rifle. Hoffman had been released from a provincial mental hospital only 3 weeks prior. James Peterson, his wife Evelyn, and 7 of their 8 children were quickly shot to death by Hoffman. The children ranged from only 1 year old to 17 years old. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson was the lone survivor of this attack, and Hoffman later declared that he spared her because, quote, she had the face of an angel. The bodies of the family were found later that same morning by a man named Will Drew Lang, who had come to the farm to help the family with farm duties. After finding the dead bodies, he had to travel 6 kilometers to the nearest telephone post to call police. A massive police search ensued, and Victor Hoffman was arrested 4 days later at his parents' house in Leask, Saskatchewan, which is about 65 kilometers southeast of Shell Lake. After his arrest, he told police that he had fought with the devil prior to the murders and described the devil as, quote, tall, black, and having no genitals. Hoffman was quickly remanded to the North Battleford Mental Hospital and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In court, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in various psychiatric institutions. Victor Hoffman died of cancer while in custody on May 21st of 2004, and this remains the deadliest mass shooting in the Canadian prairies. At number 3 is the Vernon Massacre. This was a mass shooting that occurred in Vernon, BC in 1996. 30-year-old Mark Shahal had been divorced by his wife the previous year in January of 1995, and his wife had complained to police numerous times about domestic violence, but he had no official criminal record. At around 10:30 a.m. on April 5th of 1996, Shahal drove to his ex-wife's home where one of her sisters was preparing for a wedding. Armed with a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol as well as a .38 caliber revolver, he shot and killed his ex-wife, her mom and dad, her 4 sisters, her brother, and the husband of one of her sisters. 2 others would be injured in this attack, and 2 granddaughters in the house were left unharmed. The shooting lasted only about 3 or 4 minutes, after which Shahal drove to a motel about 3 kilometers away, wrote a note to his family apologizing for the murders, and then committed suicide. In total, he left 9 people dead and 2 others injured, and this remains the deadliest mass shooting in BC's history. At number 2 is the Polytechnique Massacre. This is a very well-known event in Canada. There are many lengthy YouTube videos on this case, and this is just a general overview. On December 6 of 1989, 25-year-old Mark Lepine, armed with a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, went on a massive killing spree at the École Polytechnique de Montréal, a prominent technical school in Montreal, Quebec. He started by barging into a mechanical engineering class, where he separated the men and women, told the men to leave the class, and then shot the remaining women. He then walked through the school for about 20 minutes targeting women. He shot people in the hallways of multiple floors, the cafeteria, as well as another classroom. After his killing spree, witnesses say that he removed his hat, wrapped his jacket around his rifle, and shot himself in the head, committing suicide. In total, he left 14 women dead and injured 14 others, 11 women and 3 men. Mark Lepine was born as Gamal Garbi, the son of a French-Canadian former Catholic nun and an Algerian father. His father had been quite physically abusive growing up and abandoned the family when Mark was about 7. At age 14, Gamal Garbi changed his name to Mark Lepine, citing his utter hatred of his father. Apparently, he had also developed a hatred towards women. On the day of the massacre, he wrote 3 letters. 2 were sent to his friends and 1 was found in his jacket pocket. The letter described how he was angry at radical feminists for seeking to, quote, retain the advantages of being women while trying to grab those of the men, end quote. Obviously, this was a major event and one of the worst school shootings in history. 2 students at the school actually committed suicide soon after, and they left suicide notes describing how they were very affected by the massacre. This event was a major contributor to the Canadian gun control movement. Numerous professors and students at the school started initiatives that pressured the Canadian government, and this helped lead to the passage of Bill C-17 in 1992, as well as Bill C-68, commonly known as the Firearms Act, in 1995. Ultimately, this ushered in stricter gun control regulations in Canada. This massacre has been covered by various creative professionals, including the critically acclaimed movie Polytechnique by prominent Canadian director Denis Villeneuve. To this day, the Polytechnique Massacre remains the second deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history. And finally, at number 1 is the 2020 Nova Scotia attacks, which remains the deadliest mass shooting event in Canada. This is a complex story, and there's a lot of content out there discussing this attack, but I'll do my best to give a quick summary. So, the perpetrator in this attack was 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman, a wealthy denturist living in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. People close to him described him as paranoid, manipulative, and controlling. According to his yearbook, Wortman aspired to be a police officer, and over time he developed a hobby of buying law enforcement memorabilia and refurbishing old police cruisers. At the time of the attack, he owned 4 of these vehicles, and one person even called his house a shrine to the RCMP. However, after the attack, his partner informed police that he hated law enforcement and, quote, thought he was better than them. Gabriel Wortman had been reported to police numerous times. In 2001, he reportedly assaulted a 15-year-old boy. In June of 2010, Wortman was investigated by the Halifax police for threatening his parents. In May of 2011, police received a tip about Wortman's stash of guns and his alleged desire to, quote, kill a cop. And in 2013, Wortman's former neighbor reported him to the RCMP for assaulting his spouse and having a cache of illegal firearms. People close to him also said that he struggled with alcohol abuse and claimed that he had bragged numerous times about having lime and muriatic acid to dispose of bodies. His denture business had been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic that kicked off in early 2020, and according to his spouse, he was obsessed with the pandemic, even believing that he was going to die. He was also fearful that Justin Trudeau would begin controlling money, prompting him to withdraw large amounts of cash. His attack started at his cottage in the rural beachside community of Polytechnique, which is about 130 kilometers north of Halifax. He started by assaulting his partner, and then forced her into a nearby warehouse where he confined her to the back seat of his replica RCMP cruiser. He then set fire to this warehouse as well as his cottage, although his partner was able to escape. Wortman then started rampaging through Polytechnique, shooting and killing numerous people and setting their houses on fire. During the attack, Wortman drove an old police cruiser, and he was wearing a police uniform. After killing a bunch of people in Polytechnique, Wortman fled the area just minutes before the first police arrived. He then spent the night hiding behind a welding shop in the Deadliest area. The next morning, on April 19th, around 6:30 a.m., he drove to a house in Wentworth, which is about 37 kilometers north of Polytechnique, where he shot and killed the 2 occupants as well as their 2 dogs. At 8:02 that morning, the RCMP publicly announced that they were dealing with an active shooter situation, and about an hour later, they publicly identified Wortman as the suspect. Later that morning, Wortman shot and killed several more people in the Wentworth Valley area. He then moved on to the Deadliest area where he performed 2 traffic stops in his police cruiser and shot and killed the occupants. At 10:17 a.m., the RCMP for the first time warned the public that Wortman was impersonating an officer and shared a picture of his vehicle. At about 10:49 that morning, Wortman pulled alongside RCMP Constable Chad Morrison's cruiser. He then shot Constable Morrison, who escaped with injuries and fled the scene. About 500 meters down the same road, Wortman collided head-on with RCMP officer Heidi Stevenson. Stevenson engaged Wortman and he quickly shot and killed her. He then shot and killed a motorist who stopped to help Constable Stevenson and then drove off in the victim's silver Ford Escape SUV. Shortly after this, he shot and killed a woman he knew at her home in Shubenacadie and stole her Mazda 3. And then finally, at about 11:26 a.m., 13 hours after police began pursuing him, Wortman stopped for gas at the Irving Big Stop service area in Enfield, which is about 92 kilometers south of Polytechnique. Shortly after he stopped, 2 RCMP officers pulled up and opened fire on Wortman. He was struck twice in the head, twice in the neck, 7 times in the right arm, once in his left arm, and he had 25 wounds to his torso. Gabriel Wortman was confirmed dead by police at 11:40 a.m. In total, he had killed 22 people. He had injured 3 others, and set fires at 16 separate locations. This was absolute mayhem, and most Canadians remember the constant news happening around this time. Canadian news organization Maclean's reported that prior to the attacks, Wortman had withdrawn $475,000 from Brinks, and stated that this massive money withdrawal, as well as other evidence, suggested that Wortman was possibly tied to organized crime, and that he was perhaps a confidential RCMP informant. The RCMP would quickly deny these claims. On May 1st of 2020, in the wake of these attacks, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced an immediate ban on 1,500 makes and models of military-grade assault-style weapons, which furthered the gun control issue in Canada. There are many more interesting details about this case, and I might cover the story in more detail in a separate video down the road, but I just wanted to give you a general summary. At any rate, this series of events remains the deadliest mass shooting incident in Canadian history. And that's going to wrap this one up. Obviously, this is a very heavy subject, but I hope you found this one interesting and informative. If you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload a variety of Canadian content, and I typically post something new about once a week. If you want to support my channel further, you can buy me a coffee, and there's a link to that below. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.